And so being able to hear these women's stories is really what helped me with my confidence, feeling like, well, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Most people feel this way, right? Sharing their stories, that gave me the confidence to keep moving forward, because it's like, if she can do it, then so can I. And that's what really representation is about, just showing us what's possible.
Welcome back to the Soul's Work Podcast, the show about uncovering our authentic selves through doing both the light work and the shadow work. I am your host, Janice Ho, and I'm here today with my fabulous guest, Sheena Yap Chan. Thank you for being here, Sheena.
Hey, Janice, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here today. I'm just excited.
Me too. Well, I'm just wondering if you would introduce yourself for our listeners, whatever you'd like them to know about you.
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you who may or may not know me, my name is Sheena Yap Chan. I am a keynote speaker, consultant, author, and podcaster on building self-confidence. I have an award-winning podcast called The Tao of Self-Confidence, where I interview Asian women about their journey to self-confidence. That's now will also be an upcoming book coming out in May, so it's available for pre-order on Amazon and major book retailers such as Barnes & Nobles, Indigo, Walmart. So it's really crazy to see all that coming to life. But for me, it's very important to elevate Asian women, especially since, if you see the numbers when it comes to leadership roles, Asian women are one of the lowest, right? Yeah. And it was the sole reason why I even decided to start writing the book, because it was like, why are we the lowest? What's stopping us, right? And in our culture, there's a lot of traumas that we go through or feelings that we go through that we're not even allowed to talk about. So this is more of like, it's okay to talk about these things. It's okay to talk about intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, the model minority myth, the things Asian women face, the racism that we've been recently, that's recently heightened from the pandemic. I hear so many stories of Asian women just kind of like trying to figure out what to do or not feeling like there's an outlet for them. And it's important to talk about these things, because if not, we can't show up as our best selves, right? Sometimes we have traumas that we don't even know existed. We just put it in the back burner because for so long we've just been told to never make any noise and just do as you're told. And because of that, we become the easy target for Asian hate crimes. We don't get promoted in leadership roles. We're just seen as the hard worker versus the leader. So there's so many things that, I did my best to unpack as much as I could, so that, when people read it, they can realize, well, maybe there's something in my childhood that is stopping me, right? Yeah. Or maybe I need to ask my parents, right? Even though those are hard, right? Because sometimes our parents and our grandparents never want to share what happened to them. But I think it's really important to talk about these things, because if not, how are we going to learn, right?
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
I'm currently learning about my great grandfather and how he started his business and the traumas he had to go through, and it made me realize, like, everyone goes through challenges, right? I mean, he was a POW in World War II. He started a business out of like the worst times in the Philippines. And so, it's just proof that no matter what situation you're in, you can go out there and make it happen. But we also have to have the right mindset, right? It's kind of like, if you want to learn karate, but you don't think you're the best, you can't give the best kick, how are you going to practice to give that kick, right? Mind, body, everything, it's all connected.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for all of that. And that's such a great like summary or precursor to like everything we're going to dive into today. So I appreciate that. And you know how much I appreciate that you are someone who is willing to talk about these hard things, because I know it is very difficult for a lot of us as Asian women or Asian folks in general. And I just feel like so much less alone in knowing like I'm not the only person who is an Asian person who wants to really dive into hard things like intergenerational trauma, what have you. So we're definitely going to like go into that. But I wondered if like to start, because I definitely see you as like a leader, if you will, in the space of elevating Asian women, being a voice for Asian women, like providing platforms for us and our voices to be heard. I got to be on your podcast, which was amazing. And, to help us build up our confidence in ourselves and in navigating a world that we don't always feel elevates us, right? So I'm curious, though, to know, before you got into all of that and sort of your leadership role in it, like what was your own personal journey to like finding your own voice, to building your own confidence as an Asian woman in this culture, and to like speak out the way that you do? Like, was it a gradual process, or were you just always this like vocal and badass?
Definitely not as vocal, definitely not as confident. I mean, growing up in Toronto, it all stemmed from my childhood, not seeing anybody in the media that looks like me. All I ever saw was blonde hair and blue eyes, so I was always ashamed of being Asian. And then growing up in an Asian household, right? You just do as you're told. And so it felt like I always needed permission from somebody, right? I couldn't make a decision for the life of it. I would second guess every single thing that I did. I would fear everything, right? I would have analysis paralysis. So yeah, I went through it all, right?
Yeah.
And the main reason why I started my podcast was because I was literally trying to find resources that catered to Asian women's confidence, but I just couldn't find any. There was nothing out there. And this was 2015. And so I thought, maybe something was wrong with me because I'm the only one feeling this way. But then at the same time, I realized as well, we don't talk about our problems. So I started the podcast as a way to provide support and also provide better representation, because we're still seen by our negative stereotypes, which is unfair. And because of that, we get less promotions. We're not taken seriously in leadership roles. Sometimes we're seen as like items you can order off a catalog. It's unfair. And a lot of women are getting hurt because of this negative stereotype, right? And so I wanted to showcase Asian women who've been able to overcome their obstacles, overcome their fears, overcome their traumas to be who they are today. And so being able to hear these women's stories is really what helped me with my confidence, feeling like, well, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Most people feel this way, right? Sharing their stories, that gave me the confidence to keep moving forward, because it's like, if she can do it, then so can I. And that's what really representation is about, just showing us what's possible, right?
Yes.
And it's even better when it's someone that looks like us, right? I mean, when you see like the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once and the accolades it's been getting, like you see Ki Hui Kwan, who's been getting, not like awards after awards after awards, and he was on the brink of quitting acting because there was no roles for Asian Americans at the time. And if it wasn't for Crazy Rich Asians, then he wouldn't be here today. So this is why representation is so important. Like if there was no Crazy Rich Asians, he wouldn't get back into acting. If he didn't get back into acting, he wouldn't be able to break barriers, right? He's been able to break so many barriers because he made a decision to go back into acting when he saw the movie Crazy Rich Asians. And, just every time I see him speak or, have his acceptance speech, it makes me want to cry. Not, cry happy tears, right? Because like I understand what it's like when there's no representation and you feel like you can't go out there and do something because you don't see somebody else that looks like you, or there's not a lot of opportunities for Asian Americans, right? Because of maybe the model minority myth, right? They all think we're successful, so we don't need any help, which is far from the truth. Or they think all Asians are financially successful, when that is also far from the truth. So there's so many different things, so many different factors. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, we can go on for hours talking about this.
I know. Actually, what you brought up just now also made me wonder for you, because I know your focus is so much on Asian women, but like, do you also end up talking to a lot of Asian men in sort of all of this work you do around Asian representation? And do you hear from them like similar things?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just because I focus on one group doesn't mean other people can't relate to it. I talk to women from other cultures. I talk to Asian men. I talk to men from other cultures, and they go through similar situations as well. Like men deal with confidence issues. Asian men deal with confidence issues as well. When it comes to leadership roles, the numbers are still very low compared to other cultures. So it's not like people can't benefit from it. Of course they can, right? And for me, it's important to share our specific stories, because it's through our specific stories where we can have a different perspective on things, or maybe create a different solution. Because for this longest time, like every time I would do something or, apply for something or talk about something, I was always told, well, my story catered to a specific audience. So but what does that even mean, right? Like, is it because I'm Asian? Is it because I don't have blonde hair and blue eyes? So it doesn't, people don't think, they can like relate to what I go through,
Right.
or like, it's just, there's so many things, right? And we need to also realize like we have to go out there and advocate for ourselves, right? When people complain about having more representation, it's like, well, if you really want it, it really has to start with yourself, even if you have no clue what you're doing, right? Even if you have to start from the bottom. And every little bit counts, right? Every little bit counts, especially when you see like, in 2021, Asian women only represented 2.7% in corporate and leadership roles. We have a lot of work to do, right?
Yeah.
Because that's very low. That's very low. And then I think a report from McKinsey last year mentioned that it dropped 80%. So what are we left with, right? So this is why it's such a huge problem. This is why it's so important for us to speak up, to showcase better representation, because the Asian women who have forged their path have broken barriers, right? Have shown us what's possible. So, and that for me is a sign that we can make this happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, that leadership piece is so important because I did internalize all of those same stereotypes and, seeing the lack of representation in education and workplaces and things like that in the wellness space, right? Really did leave me with a sense of like, I don't belong at the top, quote unquote, at the top, right? And I think like when I really think about who I am authentically, I am someone who wants to say some shit, I am someone who wants to put myself out there and who has an opinion and a perspective. So I think having unlearned a lot of these things that were ingrained in me that were really not aligned with who I was has really helped to shift some of that in both in my mind and in my behaviors and just how I feel about it. But that's definitely been a process. And within that, it's like you're saying, like seeing actually, visually seeing people who look like me in those roles are part of what has helped me build my own confidence as well. So yeah. And you're one of those people. So
thank you.
So I really want to hear more about your new book. And I know you do talk about intergenerational trauma and historical trauma as part of that. And again, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to you that you're willing to have this specific conversation with me and putting it out in the book, because I've done so much of my own personal work around intergenerational trauma. Like I've researched so much about my family history. I have grieved like so many tears, not just for myself and the pain that comes up for me, but for the people before me, the generations before me, who I felt like didn't have that support or opportunity to grieve. And it has helped me to better understand my parents at like such a deeper level, the kind of relational dynamics we had and still have, to understand more about myself and why I am the way that I am, and to have like this very deep sense of compassion for them that I don't think I would have had if I hadn't done that really, really deep exploration and healing. But I know that it can be a really hard conversation to have because there can be a lot of shame around like, am I like airing my family's dirty laundry or like that kind of like sense? So yeah, I'm just curious, like, one, if you can share more about your book as it relates to intergenerational and historical trauma. And then, what has been like some of your own personal journey in working through those things? And have you also experienced the shame or those barriers in taking that exploration?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, when you grew up in an Asian household, you've been taught to do one way, right, of living your whole life. And so even when I was approached to write this book, like I still was dealing with major imposter syndrome, thinking like, can I even write this book? Like, who am I to advise people on this, right? So, I share some of the experiences I go through, even some of the traumas I've been, and understanding my family too, right? I mean, our family knows what they only know, right? So sometimes we have to understand like that's all they know. And we can accept it. We can try to change it, but the older they get, the harder it is to change their ways. And so sometimes we just have to respect it. And I know that's not probably the answer most people want to hear. But at the same time, our parents, our ancestors, they do it out of love. They probably thought that was the best thing they can do, right? Like I just found out, my great grandmother, her feet was binded back, and that was huge in China, right? Because it showed status, it showed that it was a standard of beauty. And we have to realize, well, why was that even considered, a standard of beauty, right? Because, back then women with smaller feet were considered beautiful. I mean, there's lots of things to unpack for sure. Even just the traditions that we do, we never question about it, right? It's like, why are we doing this, right? Like, what's the main reason? And of course, when you ask, the answer is like, because we do it, right? Not with no underlying reason. And for me, I just want to know, right? Like, are we doing it for the sake of tradition, or is this tradition really affecting women, right? Because there's a lot of traditions that benefit men over women, and that's just the hard truth, right? And sometimes we've got to question the things that we do. Right now that, we are more aware, we understand a little bit more, we have to like question some things, because if we don't, then we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And yeah, it's not easy sometimes to talk about these things, right? Like I come from a huge Asian family, right? Yeah. My grandmother has 12 siblings. If you check out like our Christmas family photo last year, there was like at least 200 members, and that's not even all of it. Yeah. Wow. And so sometimes you just gotta push through, because not everyone's going to understand what you do, especially your parents. But when you're committed and they see like the results, they'll understand. And it's not that they're not for it. It's just sometimes they don't understand it. Yeah. Right. Sometimes, for them, success is working a job from 9 to 5 until you're 60. I couldn't see myself doing that. I would literally like sit in my cubicle and be like, I can't do this. Like, and I'm not saying it's, having a job is bad, because if you love your job, that's great. I've met people who even love working at the dollar store, right? And I think that's amazing, right? You should love what you do, whether it's being, a cashier at McDonald's or owning your own business. But if you're unhappy, then we got to do something differently, right? And it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of risk. It takes a lot of, overcoming all your fears and anxiety, right? But once you get to the other side of that, it's magical. It's amazing, right? If I didn't go through, the things that I went through, I wouldn't be here today, right? Going through so much rejection, not feeling good enough, thinking, going through imposter syndrome, trying to overcome my fears. Like those things are not easy. Or even like leaving a job to do something on your own. That's a courageous thing to do. And I think we forget to honor that, right? Because not everyone can do that, right? Especially when you've been taught to always have a stable, comfortable life. When in reality, we have to learn to embrace the uncertainty in life, right? I think the pandemic was the big proof of that. Like, we can push through something that we had no idea what was going to happen. So yeah, I kind of maybe could have went off topic, but I mean, the book is really like a guide to kind of like figure out what are some of the things that are holding you back, how you can heal through it and build on it, right? Like having self-love, building confidence. But we have to get to the root of the problem and find ways to heal it. I mean, I'm not a licensed mental health therapist. I always say go to a licensed mental health therapist if you have to. But being able to interview so many women and just the life experiences I've been through, I realize we have so much to work on, right? Yeah. We have so much to deal with. We have so much to like just heal as a community as well, because I mean, look at what's happening with our community. Elderly every single day is getting attacked for no apparent reason. Women are getting attacked, just because of the color of our skin or the cultural background we're in. And when it comes to DEI efforts, most of the time Asians are not considered people of color, unfortunately, which is really sad, because it's like, we are in that, but they don't include us in that because of the model minority myth. So there's so many things that I mentioned in the book, just kind of like, we need to be aware of these things. We need people to be aware this is what we go through so that we can find better solutions. We can understand each other. And actually, it's funny because I have a lot of licensed mental health therapists like say, I need to order this book for my clients because this can really help them, right? Yeah. Just kind of talk about the hard topics like mental health, the taboos that we go through. even just the history that each Asian country goes through, right? Like, in China, you're like pressured to get married. In India, child marriage is still prevalent, arranged marriages. In Japan, like women are treated unfairly. I mean, all these things still happen today, and we need to find ways to solve those problems, right? But if we're not aware of it, then how can we solve them? If we don't talk about the hard stuff, right? The things that your Asian parents don't tell you or tell you not to
Yeah.
say.
Right.
So,
Oof.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot of unpacking in that book, but I think that's what's necessary if you want to be a leader. We need to unpack a lot of things before we can move forward. Because if not, how can you be the leader that you're meant to be if something is still holding you back and you're not even aware of it, right? And it's not even just your trauma. You might be carrying the trauma of your ancestors, right? And they say intergenerational trauma goes four generations deep. But I personally think for Asian women, it goes way deeper.
Yeah. I would not be surprised. Yeah. Oh, wow. Like so much comes up for me in what you just shared. One, for sure, this piece about like the holding back, like, and what are like the really deep underlying causes of why we have these blocks, for example, to moving forward, to being, in our leadership, in our confidence. And I think a lot of times, and I've said this before on the podcast, where I think a lot of times we want to jump into this new us that we want to see. Like we want to just somehow manifest this like confident person that we like envision ourselves and we kind of like know that we should be able to be. But sometimes I think this part about, but what is the actual thing that's like holding us back, that's been in place for probably our entire lives, that tell us that we can't do that there is actually a protective, almost like mechanism there. Like it's to, survival, like all the things that do go back generations as to why our people had to take on these like ways of making ourselves small and silent and not rocking the boat or not being too much or taking up too much space. Like so much of that has been protective and for our survival. It's just that over time, of course, it has these impacts of where maybe we don't feel we can be authentically ourselves and really show up and take space in the room. But I think like you're so right in that, like at least that's been my experience, is that when I can go deep into what are those like underlying blocks that have been very protective but are no longer serving me, really work through that, heal that, and respect it and have compassion for it. Like that's been the thing that then as that subsides, I just organically become more confident. Like it's not something I'm pushing myself to be or try to become. It just sort of happens. And also with practice of like putting myself out there, doing my podcast to put my voice out there. Like, yes, there are things that I do to practice this new muscle of like putting my voice out there and showing up and all of that. But I think that this other piece often gets bypassed. So I'm so glad that you talk about that in your book. And yeah, I'm with you there 100%.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to also talk about, our experiences as Asian women living in Canada. You've already alluded to this a bit. We're both in Toronto. And, we talked about this a bit on our call where it's interesting here, especially in Toronto, where there is a lot of like cultural diversity. And we tend to, I think about it as like, oh, we're so progressive and we're like so accepting of all cultures and whatnot. But like there is still racism here. There is still discrimination.
There's discrimination. And I think in Canada, there's a thing is like I call it polite racism.
Yeah. That.
I mean, it's crazy when people think that racism doesn't happen in Canada. I just like, sometimes I just want to roll my eyes and be like, are you crazy? Toronto and Vancouver has the highest Asian population, and Vancouver has, a higher per capita when it comes to Asian hate attacks versus America. And so people need to realize like it also happens here, right? Yes, we are a very multicultural city. I love the fact that Toronto is very multicultural. Like you can literally get any cuisine from the world, which I think is amazing. Of course, like as Asians, we love to connect through food. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's still so much we have to work on. Like even just going to a networking event, the amount of women of color that go is like, it's like just a fraction, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Even last year, I was on Facebook and someone had a sponsored post for a women's event, and I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Maybe I'd like to go and see what it's about. But when you see the speaker lineup, you see like 9 Caucasian women and like 1 African American woman, and then it's like it's a turnoff. It's like,
Totally.
where's the diversity, right? I mean, one person of color cannot represent all of women of color, right? It has to be, at least equally distributed, right? And that only happened last year. And so seeing that, it just made me like sick to my stomach, because it's like 2022 and that's what we're going through. And even companies, right? They keep saying they're diverse, they're diverse. Yes, they're diverse in lower level employment, but what about the upper level? What does that look like, right?
Totally.
Diversity has to go all across, right? On all levels of employment. And even then, like, I think in the States, I think you might, I don't quote me on this, but I think you just need to be like 5% diverse to be considered a diverse company. And
Oh, wow.
that's crazy, because 40% of America is people of color, and it's going to overtake it. So there's just so many different things. And this is why it's so important to speak up, to to call out those things sometimes, right? Because it's like, what are you guys doing? Like, what are you really doing?
Yeah.
Is it just, are you doing it to look good? Is it just smoke and mirrors? Or are you really for it, right? Are you really creating the change you want to see? Because there's so many amazing, talented people out there, right? People of color, it doesn't matter. Like, there's so much talent out there, but sometimes, they see our faces, they see we have smaller eyes, and then, we get disregarded, right? Because of it. And I've seen women who lost business just because they found out they weren't Caucasian. And it's unfortunate that that still happens today.
Oof, yes. And yeah, it is crazy to me how there are so many people in Canada or Toronto who think that this doesn't exist. Because for me, I see it everywhere, just like you're saying about like the kinds of people. Like I when I worked in my first career as a researcher in the criminal justice field, I knew that every time I walked into a board meeting in whichever place I was working in, like it would just be a sea of like white faces and maybe that token, 1 or 2 people of color. And the people in, who were teaching in my schools and the people who did have like executive leadership roles in the workplace. It's like, I just knew, I knew before I even stepped foot, like what would happen, and, I think about it in terms of like the neighborhoods in Toronto and who are still really in the more like quote unquote like rich neighborhoods or upper class, whatever you want to call it. Like I see the divisions everywhere, and it can feel kind of like crazy making or gaslighting when people are like, oh, but it's Toronto and it's like so multicultural, and I'm like, that doesn't mean that it's like equal or fair, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so thank you for thank you for that.
No worries.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about in terms of like this thing about assimilation, because that is sort of our common like cultural way of being here, right? Like whether you're an immigrant who comes here or maybe you're born here like me, but you're not part of the dominant culture, and just this thing of like assimilating or like moving toward dominant culture, which is white dominant culture. And, I think about the ways that, like you were saying, when we grow up and we see what the standard of like beauty is or what it means to be successful or like all of these things. And now that I've really consciously explored some of this, that I can see all of these different ways that I was trying to like move towards being closer to that center of power and privilege, the ways that I gave up parts of myself and sort of like detached from my own culture. And already that was already hard because my parents had to flee their homeland and cut off parts of themselves because of war, threat of war, whatnot, and coming here. And then how that's even more exacerbated for me. And so I almost feel like it's contributed to this like abandonment wound that I have, where there's like almost this thing that this part of me that is missing. And I'm curious to know if that's been a part of your experience, if you have felt like you've had to sort of, sort of like exile parts of yourself in perhaps assimilating here or trying to like just make it in this
Oh, yeah,
culture.
for sure, right? Like especially if you work in a corporate setting, right? Like I mean, you have to show up a certain way or else they don't take you seriously. Especially as an Asian woman, I mean, I'm glad that, they say Asian don't raisin, but that can also be a curse for us because it's like they don't take us seriously or we get mistaken for like the secretary or the help, not realizing like, I'm actually the lawyer or the boss or the manager. Like back then, it's like I always used to think that I could only reach a certain cap in my career because I'm Asian. So I never did anything outside of that. And even if I tried, someone told me, "Well, as a woman, you make more than enough. So why should you even bother?" And so I believed that person, right? Because at that time, my confidence was low, right? Because I didn't feel I was good enough. I didn't have, I wasn't worthy. I always, I was always worried about what others thought of me, and so I never wanted to rock the boat as well, and just assimilated to Western culture or whatever Western culture it is or dominant culture. And I think a lot of us try to do that, right? And then they've also forced it on people, like what happened with the residential schools. Like it's like appalling, right? When you hear news that like 200 identified bodies were found in one school, and then another school was, you find another like 50 unidentified bodies, and what they went through those schools to just so that they could feel more accepted, even though indigenous people, came to America and Canada first, right? It's like it's crazy. I remember watching this movie on Netflix. I think it's called Dark Horse, but it's talking about an indigenous man's life in the residential school and how it really affected him in his later life. Because one of the things he was good at was playing hockey, but because he was so traumatized by what happened to him in the residential schools, he just went through a different path. Right? He never was able to heal from his trauma, and just went through this bad path. And then of course, when you're given like a chance to play hockey, and you're like the token indigenous person out of everyone, you're gonna go through racism. You're gonna go through all kinds of harassment. And so if you're not mentally prepared to handle that, you're gonna quit, right? Because who wants to go through that? And most women in leadership roles quit because they can't take that pressure. It's like, yes, we've made it to the top, but it's not even, that's nothing, right? Like, it's great, but like, there's still a lot of work to do, right? Imagine being like the only Asian female leader, and then you still have to go through all kinds of crap, right? I've spoken to lawyers who made partner and still get harassed, right? Or not being taken seriously, or get backhanded compliments like, oh, for an Asian woman, this is pretty good. It's like, what does that even mean?
Right.
I don't go up to people and like, for a Caucasian man, you did well. Like, who says that, right?
Yeah.
So why is it because we're Asian? It's like it's a disability, or it's like, it's like it's treated that way when there's so many talented women out there who can create change for the better. Like, if we had more women leaders out there, I think the world would be a way better place. We wouldn't have as much wars because most of these wars are all ego trips when you think about it. And as women mostly would hash it out until they find a solution, right? Most of the time. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, something just came up for me when you were sharing. Oh, I kind of just lost it right now. But one thing I was curious about as you were saying that, yeah, there are all these ways that you and others have had to do certain things to assimilate. Like, I'm wondering if you feel comfortable sharing like what some of those things looked like for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, in my 20s, I dyed my hair blonde, to feel more accepted. And but a part of me knew it wasn't me. Like, I would look in the mirror, it's like, that's not me. Like, I don't have blonde hair, right? So I actually decided to color it back to my original hair color. And that was the first time I really said, yeah, this is me. I'm Asian. And I just started embracing my culture. And it's funny because when I say that, a lot of people are like, that was my moment too. Even being ashamed of like the foods you brought to school, right? It's like bringing noodles, and they're like, ew, are you eating worms? And it's like, no, it's noodles. And I love Asian food. Like, I don't care There's lots of great cuisines out there, but nothing, like for me, nothing beats Asian food. It's like the best comfort food ever. But even
Yes.
little things like that, right? Or, you go on a date with a guy who's not Asian, and they're just like, I've been to China once. And I'm like, great, I've never been to China. So I don't know, just like little things like that, like just the monoliths, the stereotypes. As Asians, we're always grouped as like one thing when there's so much diversity within the Asian population.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm also thinking about how I did the code switching thing when I was entering, especially like my master's or undergraduate program, where it's like I used to talk in a lot of slang,
Yeah.
and because of just who I grew up around and whatnot. And it was like I learned very quickly what it meant to sound like quote unquote professional and, put on the academic voice and like that code switching because I knew what I needed to do in order to be more palatable to those who were in positions of power and to be more like, again, moving towards that center of power and privilege. And what does it look like, that standard that's been set of how you should speak to be taken seriously, right? And how you should dress, like the ways that I, gave up sort of my authentic way of dressing in certain colors and things like that to try and fit in more and blend in more and not stand out. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things there, and definitely like seeing just this one standard of beauty in TV shows and Barbie dolls and like things like that growing up, where I felt this like envy and this longing to look like that and not like me. And I just find that so devastating that is what we are taught at such a deep unconscious level. And now it's like, shit, got to do all the work of unlearning that. But yeah, I'm just like really sitting with all of that as you're sharing. Yeah. And then also too, like hearing you talk about this idea of like certain Asian women might get into, leadership roles, like the few, but there is this like environment that doesn't enable them to like thrive in it and to feel welcome in it. And, so there's that piece, because I think sometimes the narrative is like, oh, well, everybody has a fair shot, right? You just have to work hard. No,
they don't.
No,
honestly, they don't.
No.
Just getting that position is great, but that's only the beginning. There's still a lot of pushback and challenges that people don't realize. And if you're not mentally prepared for it, I mean, it can take a toll on you, right?
Yeah.
It's hard. It's tough, right? And yeah, like I think it's just we need more stories to know like, yeah, we made it, but it's not always, it's not always icing on the cake. There's still so much work we have to do,
right.
to just be even taken seriously, right? We have to work 100 times, 1,000 times more to prove our worth, unfortunately. But if no one does it, who else will, right? So, I mean,
and I feel like
I feel like hopefully for me, the book is a starting conversation to that, just something that people need a wake up call from. So, yeah.
And I was going to say, like, I feel like the work you're doing, whether it's the book or, like the meetups, like where you get, I'm always seeing on your social media where like you're bringing Asian women together and like having that support where it's not just us dealing with this on our own or feeling alone in it, because it is challenging. I think is such a huge part of that process. Yeah. So I'm curious to know if, where we've talked about sort of like ways that we've maybe had to cut off parts of our cultural roots, if we want to call it that. Are there ways that you've been able to like preserve that or come back to that, whatever that means for you, and like what sort of helped you in that process, or what's been protective for you in being able to kind of connect with your culture?
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, there's certain traditions that I do follow because it makes sense for me, right? So I don't say like don't follow all traditions. You got to figure out what makes sense. Sometimes we got to question some of the traditions if it helps us or hurts us, right? So For those of you who may not know me, red is my color. And red in Chinese culture is a happy color. It's a lucky color, right? When Chinese New Year comes, you get the lucky red envelope. So it also signifies abundance and wealth. And so, I use that not only because I like the color, but it also is an homage to my culture, right? Like, for me, red represents confidence and courage. And then at the same time, it's also a happy color in Chinese culture, right? We wear it for birthdays, when it's Chinese New Year or any special occasion, we get the lucky red envelope. So there are certain things that I do follow that make sense, right? And I think we just have to figure out what works for us because everyone's different. What may work for me might not work for you. Right? Maybe your color isn't right. Maybe your color is yellow, and then we figure out why, right? I mean, the beauty of when it comes to building your confidence and finding yourself is you get to choose what works for you, right? And I know it's sometimes easier said than done because for so long you were just like given one route to like follow the path, but I mean now there's just with the internet and social media and like there's just so many different things you could do, right? So many things. As long as you're not hurting anyone, there's just so many different things you can do.
Totally.
And there's so many things you can learn and figure out what will work for you.
Yeah. I'm still finding my way, and I find it hard because of all of the separation for me between me and Korean culture. But definitely food is something where I feel is like a little bit of an easier place to start because like you said, like how can you not feel connected with food? So yeah, that's kind of been part of my like very, very slow journey. But I really appreciate you saying that because sometimes I can feel almost like this pressure of like having to do all the things or like what does it mean to be Korean and connected with Korean culture. And, I think just your reminder is really helpful in what is the right thing for me and what is the right thing for me at this given time, given that I've been so like disconnected. And maybe that's just a little baby step right now. And later on, my capacity or interest or community even, will grow and it'll be something else. So I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. So I feel like I really just have one last question, but it's a big one, which is that, when I think about the impacts of really huge things like intergenerational trauma, racial trauma, historical trauma, and I think about the ways we tend to approach healing in this Western culture. And I'm training to become a therapist. So,
Nice.
Hey, I am. Yeah, thank you. And I acknowledge that I'm training within like a sort of Western therapy framework. And that tends to be very individualized, right? But, for things that are this big, that often have like, sometimes centuries of like emotional charge behind them, I'm really learning how important it is to heal in community, heal with others. And, I think in the individualized approach, sometimes things like spirituality even or connection with our ancestors or, maybe some certain cultural elements are taken out of the equation. So I guess I've just been thinking a lot about that piece of what do I need in terms of support, and maybe it's more communal support of some kind that is beyond just me as the individual taking it all on. And I'm curious to know if for you've experienced that support or if that's something that's important to you in
support.
kind of,
Support is very important, right? I mean, for so long we've been conditioned to not ask for help because it's shameful, it's considered a weakness, we're asking for a handout. Well, we can't do everything ourselves. That's just the hard truth, right? I wouldn't be here today without the help of people supporting me, listening to my podcast, buying books, right? I mean, I don't even believe in self-made because it takes a community to get to where you are today. And it's important to know where you come from, right? Where it's humble beginnings or whatever that may be. Like you have to understand that support can just make things better. Right? Like talking to a licensed mental health therapist, creating platforms to help you heal. Like I have a friend who is also a licensed therapist, and she started a platform utilizing K-dramas to promote mental health. And so by doing that, she's not only healing, her Korean community, she's actually healing a lot of people in different countries because, after when the pandemic happened or the lockdowns, K-dramas and K-pop just was a big hit, right? And it's actually produced such a diverse community where you see people in Brazil trying to learn Korean, or you see people in Africa watching Goblin like 27 times. I'm just like, this is amazing. And so support is needed. You need to have help. It's okay to ask for help. And I keep saying that in my book. I keep saying it's okay to ask for help. Go ask for help, right? Talk to a mental health therapist if you have to. Join a women's group. Listen to podcasts, read books, whatever that support may look like for you, because we can't do everything ourselves. I mean, I was stubborn too. I tried to do everything myself and it just delayed me. I ended up feeling like the worst person in the world. I would just keep beating myself down, and it was just like a rabbit hole. And I don't want that to happen to anyone else who's listening to this, because you're here for a reason. You're listening to this for a reason. It's because you want support, you want help, you want, to find different ways to heal. And so I'm a huge advocate to ask for help, because I know I can't do it all. I'm just one person. How can I figure everything out, right? I'm not good at everything, right? I'll leave it to other people who have more expertise. And why would I want to do things alone, right? Like, it's better to be in a community where you feel supported. When days are tough, they become your cheerleaders, because we all go through ruts, we all go through bad times, and then it's having these support systems that help us, get back on our feet when times are tough. So for me, support is important. It's very important. And it's time we need to normalize it versus trying to say, oh, it's a weakness. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Because that's one way of building your confidence, is asking for support, having someone who can help you along the way, right? Because we also have a lot of blind spots. And of course, we can't see it. We need a second pair of eyes or a third pair of eyes to see those blind spots so we can correct it and move forward.
I love that. Yes. That times 10. Yeah. And I feel like some people listening might be like, what is this platform with the K-drama stuff? Like,
yeah, it's called Nuna's Nunchi, so you can check it out on Instagram. It's really great. My friend's name is Jeannie Chang. She's phenomenal. I mean, she's created such an amazing platform, healing the world through mental health, through K-dramas. It's amazing. That's all I can say.
Amazing. I'm going to check it out for sure. So is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to share before we wrap up? I know we talked about a lot, but...
Yeah, I think we've covered most of it. So...
Well, thank you so much again for being here. I'd love for you to share where people can connect with you and find you.
Yeah, for sure. So you can check out my websites, sheenayapchan.com or the selfconfidence.com, which is my podcast. You can, pre-order a copy of my upcoming book, The Tao of Self-Confidence, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and also Indigo if you're in Canada. Would love your support on that. And if you forget anything that I mentioned, you can just Google my name, Sheena Yap Chan, because I'm literally the only Sheena Yap Chan ever on the internet.
And we'll put all the links in the show notes too, for sure. Yeah. Thank you again. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a blast.
Awesome.